Welcome to Women of Culture. I'm Meera T. Sundararajan. Join me and my distinguished guests to discover untold stories from the world of culture. In the first part of my interview with distinguished Canadian writer Guy Vanderhaeghe, Guy raised what he called the case of whether a bad person can be a good writer, commenting, "I think there's lots of examples of bad people who were really good writers." Those words have proven to be chillingly prescient. For a long time, one of Canada's most famous writers was a woman who wrote carefully crafted short stories. In 2013, she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature and became an international literary celebrity. She died in May 2024. But a disturbing story has since emerged. It has now been revealed that she was complicit in the abuse of her own daughter. As many listeners will know, I'm speaking about Alice Munro, whose Nobel Award was the first for a Canadian writer and a matter of great pride for Canadians. The story of Munro's catastrophic family life raises some deeply troubling questions, and not only about Alice Munro. Among many painful details, it turns out that the abuse in question was the subject of a court case in the early 2000s, courageously brought by Munro's daughter and leading to the conviction of her stepfather, Munro's husband at the time, who pled guilty to the accusations. In other words, since about 2005, this story has been publicly known, or at least accessible as public knowledge in Canada. But where was the media coverage? Where were the questions about Munro, her reputation, and her writing? Why has this story now taken so many by surprise and shocked the literary community in Canada and worldwide? In fact, this story seems to have been something of an open secret in Canada. Munro's own biographer, Robert Thacker, comments in a New York Times article that he knew about the abuse, but that he left it out of her biography because he viewed it as a private family matter. How can abuse be considered a private matter in the 21st century? All the more so when it has been prosecuted as a crime and a conviction made. How did Alice Munro come to occupy a place like this in Canadian society, where her private life was considered to be completely exempt from scrutiny, and where unpleasant details about her were already considered off-limits for the press before she won the Nobel Prize? I believe that many Canadians, including myself, would acknowledge that Canada has had funny rules in the past for how ambitious people are treated. Guy discusses this in the interview, as you'll see, how Canadian writers in the past had to make work that wasn't too Canadian, and how they had to publish outside Canada before they could expect to be considered successful as writers. Part of this national sensitivity, no doubt a reflection of Canada's past as an outpost of the British Empire, has also meant that those who have risen to the top face certain kinds of expectations. Why did Alice Munro have to be elevated to the status of Saint Munro? And once she had been so elevated, why did the terrible truth about her family not encourage those who knew, including Munro's biographer, to speak up and admit the truth, that Munro was not a saint, but instead was a deeply, terribly flawed human being, and hold her accountable for her role in what happened? At whose door should this failure be laid? Her biographer, the media, Who else? For those who participated in concealing the truth about Munro's life, what did they think would be the ultimate outcome of their decisions? In the end, a blow has been struck. The end result is deeply embarrassing, not only because of Munro's personal life and her actions, for which she herself is ultimately responsible, but because of the broader passive complicity in what happened among those who knew. In Munro's case, this was a very public failure to confront the truth about someone who was ultimately designated not just a writer, but also a hero in Canada. But Canadian culture arguably doesn't need so many heroes. The truth is, Canadian writing has long since grown up, as emphasized by Guy. I would argue that Canada is more than mature enough, as a cultural presence, as a nation, for Canadians to be held accountable for our actions, to decide for ourselves who our heroes are and who they should be, and to hold our own heroes accountable. And it now plays out on social
Oh, yeah,
media,
absolutely.
of course, where a lot of younger people, I think, are particularly exposed, partly because they've grown up with the technology. They don't have the advantage of having known a time without that, and everything that happens on social media is sort of crowd driven in that way, with the possibility of ostracism if you happen to step on the wrong side of a line, or if there's something about you that somehow doesn't fit with the prevailing wind of the moment. And I think it really undercuts, for those who participate, or who can't help participating, maybe, it really undercuts their opportunities for developing the kind of sense of self, the judgments, and the independence, the self reliance that you've been.
Yeah, sometimes I don't know if it's just because I'm an old man, like you have to factor that in. But there are certain things that I find inherently dangerous. Okay. And one of them, of course, is social media because of the way it can be mobilized in so many different ways. Political mobilization, in one sense, mobilized to, in essence, destroy someone, like at the high school level, like bullying. But it generally sort of permeates the culture. And I think it makes the culture fearful. Like even businesses, a discontented customer who gets organized and is technologically proficient can destroy the reputation of a business. And you can go, it doesn't stop there. In almost any instance, you can think of it being used in a pernicious way. Now, the arguments can be made, of course, that it can also be used in beneficial ways. For instance, like, you know, just demonstrations against authoritarian governments or whatever, they're often mobilized on social media, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we have to think very I think we have to be at least wary about some of the water that we step into, because it may be very much deeper than we think it is. And I think that while the idea of the lone wolf genius in terms of writing, those supposedly stupendous figures who stood above everyone else, right? Like the commanding genius, blah blah blah, all that sort of stuff. That's a bad idea, okay? But the idea that writers allow themselves to be edited into homogeneity or blandness or insipidity is also not good. Often treading the middle ground is the safest ground to tread.
Yeah, which is, not a very
No,
exciting
no.
place to be,
It's like liberal democracy is
and
not very exciting either, right?
well, I don't know, it depends on what gets
Yeah,
done.
no, exactly. But the thing is that it does certain forms of government have always had difficulty, right? Because they often fail more than they succeed. And other forms of government that promise instant success of whatever kind are often much more attractive. Coasting along. this this is sort of like a kind of like an old man's opinion. At my age, I want to avoid danger. Things that I think historically have been dangerous or pernicious, or in some ways are frightening. And I tend to find the times now redolent of a little of the stench of the 1930s. I'm very concerned about many of the things that are happening, the divisions that are appearing in society, the contrast between left and right, or whatever you want to call it. So anyway, I've wandered very far off track there, and
No, not at all, actually. I think, all of this is totally relevant, and in fact, the word that kept coming to mind for me was groupthink as you were
yeah,
talking. Um, but, I always find it difficult to have these discussions partly because my own sort of mental picture of what a writer is or who a writer is very conditioned by my personal experience, and, in particular, the figure of my great-grandfather who was a very important, poet in India, C. Subramanian Bharati. He's always sort of before my mind as a vision of, "Oh, okay, that's what a
right,
writer is." And, he was a very good person who had a lot of humanitarian ideas that he, incorporated into his writing. But I was also thinking about how his experience is relevant to a lot of our conversation because he was a complete, outcast from his own society. Uh, and now people love to say, "Oh, he was so great," and, uh, people in India, Tamil speakers, "Oh, we celebrate him and he's the greatest." And that's all fine, but if you and it's very sincere, but if you look at his actual life experience, he was doing things that really upset a lot of people, uh, and not just the British government, but people from his own community. Talk about ostracism. That was the way the whole caste system operated back in the day, and hopefully that's not the case anymore. I'm just gonna not even gonna go further with that comment, but it certainly shouldn't be the case now or in the future. And Bharati totally rejected the caste system and went and fraternized with people from other so-called lower groups. He ate with them, which is a big taboo in the traditional society, and as a result, he actually got thrown out of his own house and had to go live
yeah,
somewhere else. So at the time, a lot of the things that he was doing uh, were not accepted by many, many people. Now, there were other visionaries like himself who understood what he was doing and accepted that. And then in historical hindsight, now we see him, the public sees him as not only as a genius, but as a hero. And as a person in his family, I'm extremely proud of having someone like that in my background. But that took a lot of time to develop, and that was paid for by a huge amount of rejection, inconvenience, and self-questioning that he went through.
Yeah, I mean, I think often the greater the writer, the greater the chance that they will be ostracized. Um,
Absolutely.
like one of the things that I always find kind of amusing in a cynical way is that you look at James Joyce, he couldn't get his books published in Ireland. He lived as an exile, but now Dublin celebrates Bloomsday, right? Because
Yeah.
it brings enormous numbers of tourists to Dublin who walk in the steps of Stephen through the streets of Dublin. Why do they do it? I doubt that any of them in the Board of Trade or whatever it is in Dublin ever read a word of Ulysses
Well, why do they do it?
because he's good
I'm
for
waiting with
business.
bated breath.
You know,
Hmm.
Joyce is now a commodity that can be exploited. Yeah, he's good for business. And someone has told them that he was a great writer, right? So, okay.
May I suggest something more than
Yeah,
that, though, Guy? Which again fascinates me, and I think it goes back to some of the things you were saying about genius and this idea of the lone individual genius. I mean, I always find myself frustrated that it's so difficult to talk about things, especially important things like these, with the degree of nuance that's really needed. I think um, you know, taking a figure like Subramania Bharati, for example, sure, I think it's fair to say that he was a genius, a literary genius, and maybe some other forms of genius as well. But the thing to understand is he had a talent, he had a vision. He was a very, very hard worker, like yourself. He also had a sort of a historical role that he played. He was integrated, interwoven with the people that he was living with the society that he was born into and grew up with. And he had an interest in all of that, in telling the stories of the people around him, very often people who didn't have an opportunity to tell their own stories. So he used folk songs that he heard, and he operated his talent and his knowledge on them and made something new out of them. But they're still, at their origin, they're drawn from Indian folk culture, from Tamil folk culture. He used, you spoke about the use of the vernacular, the so-called vernacular. Bharati actually has an essay on that subject called Vernaculars in the book that I
right.
gave you. Um, and so one of the things he did very consciously was he adopted the speech of people around him, and he saw things in that speech that he found interesting. He liked the way it sounded. He liked the rhythms, and he incorporated those rhythms, those melodies, and also the worldview into the poems and other things that he was writing. And so yes, he was a genius, and the material that he worked on came from the genius of his culture, which was embodied in all of those ordinary folk
Yeah.
who were
I mean,
around.
like, you cannot separate the achievement of a writer from whatever word you want to, call it milieu, environment, or anything else.
Exactly.
Writers, I believe, have to be rooted in some way. And the same way that your grandfather, you know, took from his culture and his language, drew on the common people, the same thing could be said like of many Western writers,
Oh,
right?
yes.
So Joyce didn't have, say, the political influence that your grandfather had, but he was intimately connected to his city, Irish English, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And part of his genius was in fact that he could draw not only on those Irish roots, but the myth of Odysseus or Ulysses, right? He could do all of these sorts of things, and that he could make the hero of his book, which is even maybe more extraordinary, a Dublin Jew, right?
Yes. Mhm.
So here is someone like your grandfather who's like drawing from all of these different sources, and he's making something new out of them. There's very few people who are given that talent or that ability or whatever you want to call it, to do that sort of thing. And I think that has to be recognized. You know, I'm being flippant. I think that James Joyce is a more important writer than Louis L'Amour. You know, we do draw distinctions, but like when you get into the idea of the democratization of culture, then that raises other sorts of questions about value, right? And questions of value are always difficult determinations. I think you can't dismiss it. You can't say we're not going to deal with that because it's elitist. What's necessary is actually to talk through these things.
Yeah, to me, the charge of elitism is intrinsically the most elitist idea of
Yeah.
all. You know, the the idea that people cannot understand that they're somehow not fit to receive the products of genius. They're not fit to understand them, to evaluate them, to accept or reject.
That's sort of like that harm argument, right? So the anti-elitist argument, I think, is essentially this. This stuff makes me feel bad, right? A Beethoven symphony makes me feel bad because I don't get it.
Well, it's funny that you should mention music, Guy. I will jump in there for a moment because as a musician myself and a classical musician at that, this is something that I also see happening in the musical arena, which saddens me quite a lot, which is that, classical music is a very highly developed form of music, but it's just
Yeah.
music. All music uses the same essential building blocks. And in fact, all music, I think, around the world, definitely in the Indian and Western music, the two systems I know well, at a fundamental level, there are really important similarities. It's the same tools, melody, rhythm, harmony in different ways. But when you talk about the classical composers like Beethoven, for example, um, I think what they're able to convey in their music is an incredibly complex emotional reality, which is inherent in all of us. That's part of our heritage, our patrimony, if you like, as human beings. That we're capable of having all of this emotional complexity and sophistication. And I think again, it's part of what we're interested in exploring when we're undergoing those voyages of self-discovery, or there's those projects of self-discovery, and it's there for us to enjoy and experience through the art form as well, through the musical art form. And a very similar thing could be said about literature. There's a complex emotional psychological reality there, and that's part of what literature preserves and makes accessible to us.
And also, like when we're talking about accessibility, there are moments in your life when something is not accessible to you, right?
Oh yes.
And then you
Hmm.
discover that it is accessible. I'll make a confession about it took me 3 attempts to read Ulysses before I read it. And
And why do you call that a
Well,
confession?
because supposedly, I would think that there would be the assumption that someone who's talking about James Joyce's genius would have immediately been smitten with Ulysses, which wasn't the case, right?
Hmm.
But when I got the book, and I'm using that in a in a,
Yeah.
in a colloquial way, when I got the book, it was revelatory. Now I had to get older to get the book. I had to have read other books before I got the book. So, just saying that anything is too demanding or too difficult, or all of those sorts of
Hmm.
arguments that are sometimes made about why something shouldn't be read or shouldn't be offered, not only to children but adults, right?
Oh, yes.
That makes no sense to me.
Hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that, you talked about democratization. And to me, the democratization of culture actually means that we not only that we make these great products, available, like you dealt with that in your life. You grew up in a situation where you literally didn't have access to books. And so, when you got that access, in a sense, your access to literature was democratized. You benefited from that. Um, but I think there's something more that's involved there too. It's a question of also making sure that people feel encouraged, to undertake these projects that maybe don't seem so easy, that are challenging, that are troubling, difficult, maybe overwhelming. I mean, for years I tried to convince my mother, who is a novelist as well and very good writer in Tamil. I wanted her to read War and Peace. And she was in her 70s at that time, and she would always laugh and say, "No, no, I don't have time enough left to read that book. It's too large." But she read the Brothers Karamazov instead, so I guess I shouldn't complain. But the point being that I think democratization also means that you encourage people to try and to go through all of the things that you've been talking about. The maybe the failures. You failed twice. You've just confessed when you tried to read
Yeah.
Ulysses. And you're not ashamed of that. Quite the contrary. You're proud. I mean, to use that word, you're proud that you were able to read it the third time.
And again, like I'm being far too confessional here. Uh, but um, when I went to university, I didn't. I'd grown up in a small town where French was taught by the gym teacher, right?
Hmm.
So I had no French when I came to university. I was lucky enough to, after my first year, to get a sort of tuition scholarship that was based on marks. So I wanted to take French, but I was afraid that if I took French, it would pull my marks down. I'd lose my scholarship. So I didn't, right? And I made sort of sporadic attempts, over time to try and learn a little French, and I'd peter out and I wouldn't do it. But in my 60s, I hired a tutor. I knew I would never be able to speak French, that was sort of beyond me. What I wanted to be able to do was read French. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I'm, I would say, 7/8 of the way through Proust in, in French, right? If you had told me that 20 years ago, I would say you're insane. But every morning when I wake up, I break out my Kindle because I do cheat. I use the artificial intelligence, the translation stuff on Kindle when I get stuck.
Hmm. Hmm. That's not
And I'm
cheating. That's smart.
bit by bit, I'm reading Proust. Okay. So as you say, it's not that people, or it shouldn't be that people won't ask of themselves to 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 do hard things, like whatever those hard things are. Why do we have a public education system? We have a public education system so that people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds have the possibility of getting an education. They have, often people have two strikes against them, and I admit that and all the rest of it. But if we didn't have a public education system, no one would get a chance. Given my background, if I had grown up in a country where education, the first 12 years of education, had to be paid for, I probably wouldn't have got to university.
Hmm, absolutely. And what you're saying, I think, is obvious to both of us. Both of us are Canadians, and I got all of my education through the public school system in Saskatoon. In fact, I got such a good education there that I often say to people that I only got educated twice in my life through a school system. The first time was in the public school system in Saskatoon. The second time was when I did my doctorate at Oxford. So that's how good that public education system was. I won't explain where I got my other degrees from or what I think about those. Now this is straying into very. I'm involved in the confessional and in such a way that I could create a good deal of consequence for myself. So I'll stop there. But I think it's so important what you're saying, and I'm glad that we've touched upon these points in our interview actually, because some of these things are things that I think really need to be said and need to be heard. And can I say I can't let that point go about Proust because I do have the privilege of being able to read French. I'm fluent in French myself. And I must say, if you had to make a choice, that was a great choice. Because not only is it a monument of world literature, but Proust's French is amazing.
Well,
And yeah. And what a great use of technology, I was about to say. All of the benefits that we potentially have through technology, being able to look up words. I can study Tamil,
yeah,
my
yeah,
mother
yeah.
tongue, in a way that I couldn't do when I was growing up because I can find the meaning of words. Dictionaries are available online. It's
Well, I
amazing.
didn't plunge directly into Proust. I did, I guess, what most people do. I started with Camus and Georges Simenon
Oh, very nice.
and and and, and people who were, their language is a little bit simpler. I guess that's a exaggeration than Proust, but I want to do it, so I kind of said I'm gonna try. I'm
Yeah.
gonna try.
Absolutely. And maybe can we bring the conversation then to Canadian literature, because you've made so many interesting comments from a broader perspective, and talked about, I think, where you see things being at the moment, where they're going in terms of literature, and especially for people who want to be involved, whether as writers or as readers. You've given us a lot to think about. But can we bring some of that now back to the specific scene of Canadian literature, and which is a very particular, uh, I don't want to say niche, but it's a very particular universe in a lot of ways. And I'd love to hear your thoughts just on what you've seen. You talked about entering the literary arena as someone with a weird last name in Canada of that time.
No,
And look at where you've gone so far. You're still very much involved in writing. So can you talk a little bit about a perspective on
well, I
Canada?
mean, one of the things is that in some ways I started writing in the 1970s, and there was a conscious effort on the part of a nucleus of writers, most of them based in, I'm speaking about English speaking Canada. Quebec and Francophone Canada was in entirely different situation. So there was an attempt by a group of writers, I think, to almost consciously create a literature. A lot of them were influenced by George Grant's Lament for a Nation. People were trying to steer the culture out of an over reliance on American culture in terms of not only popular culture but literature. There's a feeling that we had kind of passed out of the hands of Great Britain into the hands of the United States, and it was time for us to speak for the country that we lived in. And so there were literary magazines that had begun. Mentioned one of them, Grain in Saskatchewan, and there were literary publishers springing up. You know, the House of Nancy, associated with Margaret Atwood, probably, and Dennis Lee, and people like that. So it was a conscious sort of effort, I think, to build a distinctive literature. At the same time that was happening in the regions, many regional writers felt about Toronto the way Toronto felt about New York or London.
Hmm.
So it was a question, I think, of a lot of writers deciding to write about the place where they were, which was kind of a choice of mine, that I decided I was going to write about the place where I was born, where I grew up, where I was educated, and where I still lived. Um, and I'm not sure that there's something slightly artificial about that, but there are certain particular moments in time that I think are ruled by a kind of fervency. And that fervency actually gives direction to people, for instance, who want to write. Okay. They're imbued with a kind of mission. So many figures who were just beginning writing at that time, they were older than I was, actually went on to achieve international success. I mean, the two most obvious ones are Alice Munro and Margaret Atwood. Um, but, there were others. It was a good time to start writing, I would argue. It felt as if you were writing with a purpose. And by that, I mean you were probably attempting to write with two purposes, one which was aesthetic, and the other one was kind of like an assertion of identity.
Playing a part in the construction of
Yeah.
identity as well. Um, but I have to ask you about that time frame, Guy. That's really fascinating to me because you're talking about things that were starting in the 1970s, and I would like to hear more about why you identify that as a key time. Because I'm just thinking that before then, there were a number of really well-regarded Canadian writers. I mean, Morley Callahan's the one who comes to mind for me, who was very well established by the 1970s. And then, in terms of that whole issue of of a sense of place in the writing, I'm thinking of other writers there too. I mean, there's Ethel Wilson from the coast, the West Coast. Um, W. O. Mitchell from the prairies, Frederick Philip Grove, going even further back, who I think was from Manitoba. Yeah, so I'm just kind of curious about what happened in the 1970s. What about all the writing that came before? Where is that now? How does that uh, fit into the story that we would tell from the inception of Canadian literature, whenever that was back in the mists of time, through the key moment in the 1970s that you've talked about, and then today.
I, okay. I think one of the things is that writers in the 1970s recognized ancestors. Okay, whether they were
Mm.
Sinclair Ross or W. O. Mitchell or Morley Callahan, Ethel Wilson, any number of writers. One of the differences, I think, is that what was part of the 1970s was actually attempting to build the necessary infrastructure for literature. For instance, Sinclair Ross was not published by a Canadian publisher. He was published in the United States. Callahan was not published by a Canadian writer. He was published in the United States. Virtually every one of those writers that you have named, there were no Canadian publishers who were taking on Canadian writers, or very few. So to actually make an indigenous literature, you needed an infrastructure to support it. And like one of the interesting thing about Callahan is if you look at his novels, they're set more large in a generic North American city, right? The the city is not Toronto, which you would assume it would be, right? It's sort of floating. And you can see that in the work of any number of writers. Like there's a Saskatoon writer, Edward McCourt, who, if you read his novel The Wooden Sword, and you live in Saskatoon, you would say, yeah, this is Saskatoon, but it's only kind of Saskatoon, right? Like it's
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
unnamed place. And the same thing, with Adele Wiseman in her first novel. It's set somewhere in Canada, but it you would assume it is Winnipeg because that's where she grew up, but you can't identify it as Winnipeg. This wasn't true of all writers, right? I mean, like Ross is very, and W. Mitchell are very set in a certain place. It was more likely to happen with writers who were writing in a rural or agrarian tradition, where you could make up the name of a place, whether it was Horizon or Crocus, right? And that was just a small town. If you put a name on Winnipeg, it was a very particular city, right? That nobody outside of the country really knew very much about. And I think the assumption was that nobody inside the country was very interested in reading about. I'm making guesses when I'm saying this. Okay. But there was something conscious about the 1970s, right? And that consciousness was, I think Atwood put it something like, we're in the here and now. Okay. And that's what we're writing out of. And I grew up in a school system in which there was virtually no Canadian literature taught. There might have been, a few poems from the Confederation poets, and a story by Stephen Leacock, and that was about it. So in a very odd way, writing reading those writers from the 70s and seeing places that I knew named seemed oddly extraordinary. I mean, reading
Yeah.
Timothy Findley's The Wars, and he mentions Regina, it's odd that's where we were at that particular moment in time, most of us.
Hmm. Hmm. And so, do you think that's changed? Have we now sort of mapped Canada in literature?
I don't think we mapped it, but we're mapping a different kind of ground.
Hmm.
I mean, there's no question that what was being written in the 1970s was being written not exclusively. I don't want to exaggerate this. Was written largely by white writers, many of them who had Anglo-Saxon or British names, etc., etc. Now, you know, there's been an explosion of indigenous writing, uh, you know, BIPOC writing in the country, all the rest of it. So the scene has changed. It's shifted. There's also, I think, a tendency. in I'm always hesitant about saying this, but I think in some ways that there are a fair number of writers who are now thinking the way that writers did in the 1930s. We ought not to make our work too Canadian because that will make it a difficult sell internationally.
Hmm. So the whole marketing perspective on that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm not even sure if that's conscious, right? Like, I mean, in the sense that people sit, it's something that they just sort of know. Like when I started, there were virtually no agents in Canada, right? I didn't have an agent until my third book. Right from the beginning now, younger writers are connected to, the publishing world, agency, all the rest of it. They have a consciousness that is different than what my consciousness was. Somebody give me a 2000. I never entered my mind that I would ever come close to earning a living as a writer. And actually,
Hmm.
I haven't, right? I mean, I've almost always been a part-time teacher too, right? So that didn't cross my mind, right? Which made it easier to write exactly what I wanted,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
Because it's like I'm not doing it for any other reason except that I think this is what I was meant to do and what I should do. Um, so writers who come out of creative writing programs now, they know an enormous amount about the business, or at least superficially, they know a lot about the business. I didn't have a clue. I did not have a clue. Um, I just put stuff in envelopes and mailed it, and and and
Hmm.
hoped that something would come of it. And
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say, the contrast there is just so stark. And I was going to go back to the point you made about activities in groups as writers, because I think you've hit upon a couple of things that are related there. Because I suspect that those group activities are needed, for a couple of reasons. One of them being the perception that you need to be plugged into a community, in order to get ahead
that's very,
professionally.
very prevalent. I couldn't
Mm.
schmooze anybody because I didn't know anybody to schmooze, right? It was pointless.
Mhm. And your means of schmoozing, I guess,
Yeah.
were limited because you were geographically, remote.
The biggest
Um, mm,
display, and it was kind of a terrifying display, is I was invited to do a reading at the American Association of Teachers of Creative Writing. There were thousands of people there, like literally thousands.
amazing. Mm.
And what were they all doing, or the majority of them doing? They were attempting to climb the ladder, right?
Mm. Hmm.
So it was like this frenzy of people running around and trying to connect, and like, who's the most important person in the room, who should I talk to, what's the best creative writing program in the country, would they even give me a look,
Mm.
whatever,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
uh,
Mhm.
when you're in the hinterland, it's not something you can really think about very much. I suppose you could make, like, you know real efforts to cultivate certain people, but I mean, like, one of the curious things is that, like, if you live in a big cultural center, it strikes me that often a lot of your time is spent not doing whatever the art form is, It's spending time with other people who do that art form, and as you've already suggested, maneuvering your way through the business. And I'm not more moral or more ethical than anybody else. I'm just saying I don't have, because of where I live, I don't have the opportunity.
Well, that's so fascinating, but I also think that there's something very Canadian about that idea that you've expressed in the best sense of the word, not to say that Canadians interested in these things behave any different than anyone else. That's not what I'm saying, but I mean in terms of what do we have as part of Canadian culture that's kind of interesting, that's distinctive? What's special about our attitudes as Canadians? Is there something there? And I think that there is. And you've brought out one of the interesting things about Canadian culture. You know, in fact, you reminded me of the pianist Glenn Gould, what you just said, because there was a person who was incredibly successful, from the time of his debut, which of course he organized in the United States back in the 1950s, it must have been, because that's what Canadian artists did at that time, just as you've explained. They found someone to carry their work internationally. There wasn't an infrastructure in Canada that was very developed. So he did that, and he could have been someone who moved to New York and became the toast of the town in New York City, but he didn't do that. He made a choice to go back and live in Toronto in the 60s and 70s at a time when it was not, I don't think, considered to be a particularly happening place in terms of, um, culture or anything like that. And he made that choice because he said that he wanted to focus on his work and not being part of that social side of things, that was of secondary importance to him. Being an artist, the day to day of being an artist was what he wanted to focus on. And what I hear you saying sounds very similar. Also helps me to distinguish in my mind between professionals and artists, because sometimes we forget that they're not the same thing. I don't think they are the same
Well,
thing.
uh, dropping names, like I know Alice Munro fairly well. Um, and what did Alice do? Alice stayed not even in Toronto, but small
Mm.
town southwestern Ontario, with another home out like on the island in BC. I think it's fair to say that the only thing that ever concerned her was doing the best possible work that she could do. And I don't mean to speak for her, but she could be quite funny. Like I mightn't get this exactly right, but the New Yorker had a big anniversary party, and she had published with the New Yorker for years and years and years, and so they invited, the sort of staples of the book pages, uh, or the staples of their fiction, to show up. It was a bit funny the way she said it, but it was also telling. She gave me a poke in the ribs and she said, "Guy, I got to ride in an elevator with John Updike." She had that sort of modest kind of hero worship, like, going
Yes.
going on about her, and she used to
Yeah.
drive out, like, they would drive from the island back out to Ontario, and they usually went through the northern United States, and so I I was doing some sort of book thing in Montana, and the this woman in the in this bookstore said to me, "Your friend was in town and she moved all my stock." And I had no idea who she was talking about it, but it was Alice Munro, who apparently took my books off one shelf and put them on on a more prominent place. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
So I mean, it's that there was a kind of, there are always sort of rivalries and kind of
Mm.
animosities and things like that. But
Oh, you're kidding, Guy. Rivalries amongst
yeah, right.
writers?
But I think it was slightly more collegial. You know, I think, and I think it was slightly more welcoming. Like when I published my first book, I got a letter from Margaret Lawrence out of the blue, right, with advice in it. Um, and Morley Callahan said he wanted to meet me, so my publisher took me over to Callahan's house, right? Um, and we had a long conversation, right? About his days in Paris and that scene and all the rest of it. I think the feeling was, maybe it was just because I'm young. Maybe, maybe I'm kind of idealizing it or waxing too nostalgic or what. But uh, it sort of felt like we were all paddling in the same canoe,
Mm.
which was
Mhm.
which was probably an illusion, right? But there was something to it.
Yeah, I do think there was something to it, and I think that the stories that you're describing will actually be quite amazing to a lot of people. So, uh, there really is something there, I think, in terms of, the mixing of people at different stages, essentially, in their involvement in a common project, a common literary project, whatever you want to call that, whether it's the invention of Canada or, um, whatever name you want to give to that.